Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to another great event that the New York State chapter of HIMSS is putting on along with our collaboration partners. I'd like to welcome you to today's session, which will be on the new virtual workplace, more exposed to ransomware attacks. And we have a great lineup that's set up for today. Our event is sponsored today by the folks at Sirius. As you can see, a little bit of information on them, as long with their contact, telephone number, and an email address for the individual. So if you're interested in learning more about Sirius, please go check them out, and we thank them for their participation today.
All right, thank you, Tony. Good day to everyone. My name is Sebastian Roy. I'm the treasurer here at the New York chapter of HIMSS and also the producer for this event. I have a quick explanation of the different features you may be able to use during this live event on Microsoft Teams. So please note that the system offers closed captioning. If you'd rather read what folks are saying, please use the CC button at the bottom of your screen there. It isn't perfect, but it does a pretty good job at capturing what folks are saying. And I especially wanted to highlight our Q&A function. So we, the presenters, are not able to hear you speak today, the audience, but we are able to get questions from you that are submitted in writing. To do that, you need to find a Q&A button, just like the shape that's shown here on the screen with the little question mark. And you can submit questions. We have someone that will be monitoring those questions in writing. So you may receive written responses to those questions. We will also be curating them and feeding them to our panelists to respond to verbally during the event. So feel free to ask questions at any point during the event today. With that, I'll turn things over to our moderator for today, Mr. Joe Davis. My apologies, Joe, just showing your camera. So let me introduce Joe Davis, who will introduce our panelists. Over to you, Joe.
Hi, thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm going to do a little introduction on myself. I'm the Chief Security Advisor for Microsoft United States Health and Life Science customers exclusively. What I basically do is I bring my years of security advisory to the table with for our customers to help them with any pressing needs that they have around security, compliance, identity, those types of things. Today, our panelists are Jennings Aske. He's the Senior Vice President, Chief Information Security Officer at New York-Presbyterian. We have with us also Karl West, who's a former Sirius Healthcare CISO and former CISO and Assistant Vice President of Information Systems at Intermountain Healthcare. And then we also have Karen Painter-Randall. She's a partner and certified civil trial attorney at Connolly Foley LLP. And Samantha Balzarin, who is the supervisory special agent at the FBI. And I'm really excited to be here to moderate this panel. So with that, why don't we get started with some of the questions that we have lined up today? I know we're going to be talking a little bit about ransomware, but we're also going to be talking more about incident response and business continuity, things like confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, and the not so new nation state attacks that we've been seeing over the last decade or so. So my first question is going to go to Jennings. Jennings, my question for you is, how do you know if the commercial off-the-shelf or Cots applications that are running in your environment contain any backdoors or have been compromised by nation states?
Well, good afternoon, and that's a great question, Joe. It's very timely in light of the SolarWinds attacks that we're all reading about. And I guess the answer, and let me pause there, I think we could spend multiple days talking about this topic, let alone answering in a few minutes. I think the answer is that really this is an extremely difficult challenge faced by every industry vertical, and there really ultimately is no way right now for us to know with complete certainty that our software isn't compromised. The problems of the technology supply chain are extremely difficult, particularly as it relates to software. That's one of the reasons why the Senate is getting ready to start holding hearings on this topic. There are also important national efforts around the security of software and medical devices through what's referred to as a software bill of materials. You can read more about that. But I guess some of the practical things that organizations can try and do while we wait for regulation and for some of the things to play out that are on the table thanks to SolarWinds is for organizations to start asking questions, right? So when you acquire products, you can ask your supplier about, do they have the software security programs? Do they engage in things like static and dynamic testing of their platforms? You can ask your vendors for what's referred to as a software bill of materials. Can they provide you a list of all the third-party software that they use to create software? I bet for many in the audience, some of these terms are new, and really it speaks to the challenges in this space. I have a dedicated team of 5 people that focus on this topic, and I'm not sure that every hospital and healthcare provider can do that. So it's one of the reasons why we really need regulation and some government oversight in this space. And like I said, the U.S. Senate's getting ready to take up this topic this coming year. So back to you, Joe.
Yeah, fantastic answer. We all know that there's never going to be 0% risk or 100% security. Sometimes our senior leaders ask for that, but in this world that's impossible. And as my time as a chief information security officer for a large medical devices company, I ran into the same problem. You're only as good as the viability and the security of your suppliers, really, and your vendors. My next question is going to go out to Karen Painter-Randall. Karen, if an incident has been declared, what is the advantage to having an incident plan in place?
Yes, thanks everyone for having me on board today. And Jennings, it's interesting with the development of all these potential laws around the DC administration. It's going to be something that we should all watch very closely. I think we're keeping our fingers crossed that there'll be a uniform federal privacy law that comes out of this next administration, because I've got to tell you, as a breach coach, it drives me crazy to have to look at 50 different statutes to determine whether or not notification is required. It'd be nice to look at just one. But getting back to the question about incident response, listen, the bad guys don't need to rob banks anymore. You've heard that before. They're monetizing information from the comfort of their home. They're stealing the new oil of the 21st century, the protected health information, the personally identifiable information. And if they're not stealing it from you, they're certainly extorting it from you by taking away the availability of that data through extortion or through a ransomware attack. Having an instant response plan and team in place will make a difference in terms of whether or not you're going to have a successful response effort or you're going to fail at a response effort. And what I mean by that is that you ultimately will get through it, but you may be looking at more exposure as a result. I always tell my clients who are very upset about being victimized with an incident that you're not going to be judged as much today by a cyber attack, but you will be judged by the response effort that you put in place. If you cannot afford to put your head in the sand anymore with regard to having that team and plan in place. Why is it important? Typically, the first 72 hours of an instant response is critical. I know it sounds like a very short period of time, and quite frankly, without an incident response plan and team in place, you're never going to be able to respond and limit your damages within that 72 hours. It really will be impossible. The first 72 hours are important because it'll limit your legal, your regulatory, your operational, your reputational, your regulatory, and even for attorneys who are on this call, even your ethical exposure. If there are attorneys on this call and you are breach coaches, or you are running your law firm and responsible for protecting sensitive data, please take a look at RPC 1.1, RPC 1.4, ABA Formal Opinion 483, ABA Formal Opinion 495 that just came out with regard to working remotely and jurisdictional issues, and also Formal Opinion 477R, which has to do with encryption when you send information over the internet. So it'll limit those exposures. It will also maintain trust, public trust, trust with your clients, trust with your customers. You'll remain in compliance, hopefully, if you have a plan in place that you're able to use to respond to an incident. And obviously, the most important thing is with that plan in place, hopefully you'll be able to contain the incident as soon as possible, which may avoid having the malware spread throughout your system. There is the Nist incident response lifecycle that I highly recommend that you all take a look at. It's a nice framework to follow in incident response. It goes into preparation. There's 4 stages. Preparation, which is really, I think, so important as part of this this framework. Talks about getting that plan in place, having the team in place. One thing I want to mention is inventorying your assets. That is so important. I've handled breach responses, and it has taken so long to find out where sensitive data is located within the infrastructure. Having a strong infrastructure, knowing where your assets are, will certainly speed up the response effort. Certainly detect is probably one of the most important but difficult stages of incident response. Contain, eradicate, and recovery. And most important, as you've all probably already heard, lessons learned. A lot of times people will get through an incident response and they'll forget to take a step back, not to blame people, but find out what worked, what didn't work, what can we improve upon, can we change that playbook so that we can properly address, for example, ransomware attacks that involve publication or auctioning off sensitive information. I always compare it to a toothache. Someone goes in, they have a toothache, the dentist will fix it, but tells you need to come back for restorative work. And because you're not experiencing the pain, you don't come back for the restorative work. So don't forget that most important part, which is lessons learned.
Great, Karen. I really do appreciate you bringing up the potential for a federal data privacy law, because, it is frustrating. You've got, all 50 states plus the territories. And then if you're a pharma or a med device and you're multinational, you've got to deal with wherever else you're doing business, like the GDPR in Europe, etc. I want to correct a tiny error I made when introducing our panelists. Karl West is actually the former Intermountain CISO, but he's the current CISO at for Sirius Healthcare. So I just wanted everybody to know he has a new role over at Sirius. So with that, I'm going to ask Karl, how are you responding not only to cybercrime, but cyber warfare from an availability standpoint? We talk about having nation states having a kill switch within our infrastructure, and that's a bit unnerving to healthcare providers. How are you approaching that?
Yeah, Joe, a great question. And in today's world, the attacks that are occurring, this question around crime to warfare, it really has changed the nature of what is hitting our healthcare businesses. And I'm going to piggyback a little bit on things that Karen said. She hits the legal side so well. The technical, the business side is so critical. And I'll just reaffirm heavy focus on incident management processes, playbooks. These have to be in place. The playbook has to define each step in clarity and succinctness for a specific category of an event. And I think too many of us as organizations are not investing the time to define, to put this into play, and then to practice for rapid detection. I think this is the key, and Karen mentioned it. Early detection is critical. It's a key success factor. And I think in healthcare, much of our difficulty lies in the amount of time it takes us to detect. And that will lead then to some other kinds of things that I'll share. But once detected, response, and more succinctly, response time is just so critical. Response is really about having clearly defined people, processes, and technology that prevent, the expansion, detecting it early, prevent the expansion, mitigate the effects, and resolve the incident. It's critical for us to have and understand a business continuity, a disaster recovery strategy. What happens while we are responding? What happens to the patient? What happens to the member? Those are key kinds of pieces of any good incident response plan. And key services, system, and data need to be understood with plans to isolate, to mitigate the risk. If it's in one area, we need to be able to have key plans that separate, that segment, that isolate this risk. And having a segmentation or an isolation strategy, I think, is key to the things that Karen said in terms of keeping this minimized in the impact, and then being able to move on into recovery. And certainly with recovery, we're looking at making sure we have identified processes for resilience. If something occurs, what are we going to do? How do we restore the service, the capability, the system that was impacted due to the cyber event? And for healthcare service disruption, we always are aware this can mean threats to life and potential patient safety issues. So I think, Joe, a few keys to consider in your technical strategies in the CISO office. Number one, playbooks. Number two, an enterprise identity strategy is key with multi-factor and significant privileged account management. These things are just key. The use of vaults, they're key to the success that Karen has talked about. I think a third kind of key to consider, defense in depth is a strategy. It's not a product that you can buy, but having that strategy, heavy duty resilience in all that you're building. I think another tip is organized regular phish tests that occur inside your organizations. Make sure you've put that kind of a plan into place. You'll have to socialize it. People won't like it. They don't like the phishing. They don't like to be phished, but it's the way we educate, we train, we prepare people for what will happen, and it helps us. I think another thing is identity, network, endpoint, and server monitoring. If we're going to be responding to warfare, you must have monitoring in place in some critical kinds of areas. I think another thing that is a tip, good sandbox technology, a way to isolate inbound messages, examine them before they do the damage that they could potentially do. I think another key tip is a tested backup strategy. Make sure you have the business continuity. The business knows what they will do, but you need to know what technically you would do to restore systems. And do you have those system backups? Have you tested them? Can you make them work? And again, finally, just the detection tools. We talked about monitoring tools, but detection tools are key as well. Thanks, Joe.
Oh, Karl, that was great. I can recall in my career, working for an organization, one of the first hit by Stuxnet. We had just finished up our business continuity program, plan, playbook, and all that good stuff. We didn't have time to test it before we got hit with Stuxnet. And that was basically our baptism by fire. And it really showed how important it is to prepare for the inevitable, because these things are inevitable. This is not something that you can basically wish away. It's going to happen to the best of us.
And Joe, I would just add on to that. Sure. If you present to your leaders that this will not happen, then you can't prevent it. Like Joe is saying, I always want to present to leaders. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so this incident response, having the plan organized, prepared, like Karen was mentioning, that's been my mantra as well. You've got to have a plan. You have to respond quickly to mitigate. Agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Karl, when you start talking about presenting or educating your board members. I would be interested in knowing from everyone how you actually send that message to the board. I know that you can't go to the board and start talking technology because it's just not going to sink in. I think based upon what's developing out there now with regard to class action lawsuits and regulatory enforcement actions, the good board members understand how important it is to understand cyber risk and be prepared to do something about it when, you know, that incident happens. But do any of you recommend a certain approach to the board? I think if you take a business approach, they'll get it a lot faster than a technology approach.
You know, Karen, and I'll respond to that. I would tell you that coming in with a technology approach is just doomed to failure, and we have to stay away from the technology, stick to business strategies. What was the impact of an event that happened at another organization? How did it impact the business? And forget the technology, but if we can look at business and business strategy and what that does and present that to the C-levels, that is what has created some success in opportunities I have had to talk to CEOs or CFOs or COOs, share how it impacts business strategy. What does it do to the patient, to the member? How does it affect the trust relationship between patient and physician, which is so key in healthcare? How does it affect the delivery of, or in fact, the information that may affect integrity and affect the patient's safety and create harm? So you're exactly correct. That's what we have tried to do. Capitalize on opportunities that come, unfortunately, too often with other situations that have occurred. Reflect on our own strategy as an organization, how it might impact us, and then talk about what we are doing, what we can do, and why we do those things is so key for business leaders to hear.
Karl, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A directed to you. The first is, what was that phrase on identity that you referenced after talking about having a playbook?
Well, I mentioned just quickly about identity and talked, and if it freezed, my apology. I think heavy focus on identity. If you're looking at ways to fix what's happening in healthcare, you need to look at an enterprise identity strategy. And I would tell you, one of the common issues inside of healthcare is that identity is controlled outside of cybersecurity, and it isn't a central strategy. Most often when I look at healthcare and what we are doing, we focus on the EMR, the medical record system, and we make sure that identity works because that's the one that affects the patient. But the identity has to affect member, patient, employee, contractor, affiliates. Everyone has to be a part. All identities are being used to compromise healthcare. And most of the time when these breaches that were this warfare we're talking about occurs, it's because we protect one identity, but not 6 others. And those 6 others become the beachhead for the warfare that's taking place. Someone comes in through food services or through a partner organization. All identities, partner identities, everything has to be considered with multi-factor employed along with it. And I think that's a kind of thing, as we come in a minute to some suggestions from the FBI. Every time I hear of and study what happened at an organization, MFA, privileged account management, vaults being used, all of that identity, Joe.
Identity certainly is the new perimeter, if you will. It's no longer a firewall because we're all working from home now, right? So I'm not behind the corporate firewall. I haven't been behind the corporate firewall since I, was in Redmond, and right now I'm in the Boston area. So ironically, I just on my iPhone over here, I just saw a phishing email come in, and it was displayed by Outlook. So the next question is, Karl, can you elaborate on phishing and phishing exercises for the staff?
Let me click on that mute button. Thank you, Joe. I'll tell you, phishing exercises have been unpopular in healthcare. And in fact, I know of many CEOs, CFOs, CMOs who have asked for them to be shut down. It frustrates people who are busy doing work to have additional attacks come in. And so as I look at phishing and phishing exercises, I educate our leaders to the fact that if we can watch and monitor how our people respond, and if we can make it look as close to a real attack as what a bad actor would do, then we're going to have the greatest success. And so in the beginning, we had in organizations I have been associated with, we had people push back. Let's not do that. It takes time away from busy caregivers' activities. But as we looked at how do you successfully educate and train, this is a key. I wouldn't suggest it's the only key, but it is a critical key to educating and training. I'm not a heavy advocate of these exercises being punitive, but I do think you need to monitor and see if in fact you have one particular caregiver, a nurse, a physician, an imaging, a rad tech, who is at greater risk than all of his or her peers. We need to know about that. We need to then educate that manager, talk with that director and say, this particular person's having greater challenge with our cyber fish exercises than other partners. And in places where I've seen most success, those are the kinds of strategies that help. It also helps, Joe, to have the sandbox, the technology that will, before all of this comes in, we try to eliminate as much as we can. I've seen successful programs using sandboxes that are eliminating 60 to 70, even as much sometimes as 75% of all inbound email. If you can do some technology like that, some processes, that helps the people processes on the back end that are so frustrating and so difficult for us all to spot what is real, what's legitimate, what isn't. And as much as we can train, there's still going to be some mistakes, which comes back to what Karen was stressing. You've got to be able to quickly detect, and I've got to see if something hits 100, 200, 500 mailboxes, I have to catch that quickly.
Right, Karl, and I think that's what makes something like threat intelligence so important. If you have a very good threat intelligence feed, you can immediately start to detect things that other customers, other organizations have been hit with. And then obviously, if you pick up on that, you can prevent that from ever entering your email system in the first place. I think that's incredibly important. So this next question is for Samantha, and I was just waiting with bated breath to ask my first question of the FBI. How do you go about establishing a partnership with law enforcement agencies like the FBI to assist with cybercrime?
Thank you so much, Joe, and it's my pleasure to be here today. You know, most people think that you establish a relationship with the FBI or any other law enforcement agency when something happens. And actually what is most beneficial is if you create a relationship with us on the front end. So give us a call. If you ever call the main number of the FBI and ask to be put through to the cyber supervisor, you'll get to me and we can have a discussion. We can be added to your incident response plan about, you know, when and who and how you contact us. And then we can start talking about, you know, creating further relationships by doing presentations like this or tabletops with your incident response plan in that practice and how we would integrate in with your incident response team so it's most beneficial for all of us at the same time. Because a lot of times when we do incident response with the companies that we've coordinated with before in advance, we knew exactly who we need to tie in with right away. I know who to link my tech people up with. You know, I know who I'm supposed to be speaking with on a regular basis, and it just makes the whole process a lot easier and more straightforward. In addition to that, you can join organizations like InfraGard that keeps you in sync with kind of what the FBI is putting out and what's going on. And it'll also put you on the distribution for alerts that the FBI sends out on a regular basis. I'm always happy to create these relationships in advance because not only does it help us all, you know, work well together when something does happen, but I look at it this way. The attackers, the hackers, they're always working together, sharing information, passing on tips and tricks and everything else. We need to do that too, which is why I love events like this, where we're sharing that best information. And and kind of bringing everybody up. And, you know, law enforcement is a part of that. I'm always happy to talk to attorneys, incident responders, or anyone else. And sometimes if we have an enterprise investigation in a case, we're able to provide you information about a specific threat that you're dealing with that'll help you remediate your system. We can't do the remediation for you, but we can tell you where we've seen that actor hide their tools, what their typical tactics and techniques are. So we absolutely would love to be a part of everyone's plan. Thanks, Joe.
You're welcome. Yeah, I remember the days where, you know, before we really had incident response down and all of these organizations had security operations centers, where you get that phone call from the FBI saying, hey, we were doing an investigation and we found some of your trade secrets over here on this file server. Has nothing to do with your company. I just wanted to give you a heads up and let you know that your stuff is out there. Pretty scary call to get, and it's good to at least know who those folks are at the FBI before you get started, so you're not blindsided by a call like that. My next question, and we're going to go back to Jennings on this. Jennings, do you have a business continuity steering committee or a policy and plan, and do you review it quarterly or annually?
Well, the answer is yes, and I'd like to actually talk candidly about business continuity because it's a real challenge for organizations. And I think, you know, one of the things I could do is get up here and say, well, we've got a plan, we meet quarterly. But the reality is that for York-Presbyterian, and this has been my experience at Partners Healthcare with Mass General, UMass Memorial, business continuity is a very hard thing for busy organizations with you know, day jobs, so to speak, right? So the first thing that really has to happen is the organization has to, and this is gradual. Sometimes there's a precipitating event, maybe a you know, natural weather event that's disastrous for the organization. But they gradually build up the ability to actually think about business continuity as being really foundational for patient care. And so I've watched New York Presbyterian's program go from being basically an IT disaster recovery plan, where we were very focused on recovering IT systems, to being one where we actually talk about business continuity in a more meaningful way. And one of the other challenges we've had is that as an organization, you know, we've acquired hospitals, we've had multiple electronic health records, and doing business continuity around multiple electronic health record systems and things is challenging. And we're in the process of, you know, consolidating on Epic, and that's allowing us to build out one plan with downtime procedures, all the things that we need to have. Now, as far as our committee, I co-chair that committee with our VP of Physical Security. We have clinical leadership. We have folks who work in emergency management. We also, you know, conduct regular exercises, both on the IT and non-IT side. And again, we're very, very excited about the, you know, the opportunities that are provided by a single electronic health record for us to simplify how we do the downtime procedures, how we think about recovery from an IT perspective. But it's a real journey. And I'll be honest too, with our, you know, trying to help lead the response in New York City to vaccinations and what's happening with COVID. We're probably not going to do as much around business continuity planning and testing right now as we'd like, because the very same people that are doing it are also managing, you know, the armory in of Washington Heights, where we're basically vaccinating thousands of people a day. So it's a challenging time in healthcare to mature this. But the last point I'll make is that business continuity is something that's foundational, because I think if we look at what's happening from, you know, the impact of climate change on weather events, we look at some of the instability in the country that's happening right now, organizations have to be prepared to recover from events that, you know, take out power, events that lead to facility damage, you know, and I think ultimately these are pretty hard conversations to have with very busy people, as I mentioned earlier, but they're necessary.
Yeah, I think just on that point, Jennings, I think everyone on this program and watching the program will agree that you know what your situation is with regard to what you can focus on, what you can't focus on at this point in time. And Samantha probably will agree that so do the threat actors. And so it just presents an opportunity for them, which is unfortunate, but something that everyone should be aware of.
Yeah, myself here. Sorry, I'm having problems with my laptop. Anyways, it's interesting. I've had a chance to talk to some of the hospitals that were, flattened by the recent ransomware attacks, and their business continuity plans were tested. One hospital didn't have one, and it's really hard in everything going on right now in healthcare for us to develop these. But to the best you can, you got to find the capability, because the attacks are relentless. And one of the hospitals I talked to was down for multiple weeks. They didn't have that plan. They didn't have electronic health record, and they were struggling with providing treatment to patients. They had to divert patients, and so I think that's a really great point to raise, that despite the fact we're focusing all over the place, you should pick up the phone today and try to get some people working on this to the best you can.
Right.
Yeah, one of the challenges, especially with ransomware, in my experience, is that the ransomware is going after all those avenues of communication. So it's really training your staff. First of all, understanding what the most critical business processes are, and if that's providing care, obviously that's going to be critical. But it also comes down to, what do you do when you're analog only, right? What are the other channels of communication? Because I've noticed that ransomware tends to go after, critical infrastructure, and it doesn't only pose a threat to connected medical devices and the health and well-being of patients, but it also prevents physicians and caregivers, nurses, etc., and the administration from actually communicating. So are there other channels of communication? And I think that's very important to look at before you're hit with ransomware.
One thing to add, Joe, is that I recently had a conversation with our CEO about downtime procedures and other avenues for communicating, and at some level they feel extremely ineffective. I mean, we're also dependent on technology. Sure, we might be able to use our cell phones to communicate, but our patient care delivery model right now, and it's just going to keep increasing, is about networked devices. It's about connections, interconnections with external entities. And I think fundamentally what you're seeing, and I've talked to a couple of hospitals, their care model was ruined. There wasn't like an alternative option. I mean, it was just ruined, and they had to rebuild from scratch. And you can read some stories. The New York Times has done some great coverage of how damaging these attacks have been.
And there's a follow-up question from Q&A regarding testing. How often should gap assessments be conducted, and what's legal involvement? I would ask Jennings. Would you be able to address that?
I'm sorry, I had the same computer problem. Can you repeat the question?
Sure, no problem. It's regarding testing. How often should gap assessments be conducted, and what's legal's involvement in all of this?
Well, it's an interesting question. For us, we're pretty aggressive with having both internal and external tests of our security posture. We do more than just testing like our gaps with, let's say, a regulatory body like HIPAA. We hire third parties to actually mimic the sort of penetration tests. We do penetration testing that mimic the sort of attacks you might see from a hacker. We hired a company to come in and look at our ransomware preparedness. They're going to, look at how we secure Active Directory. Do we allow protocols like RDP over the internet? I think to the extent you can do both things internally and externally, you should. And I'll say this, I say it quite often. I think if you look at this from a regulatory perspective, you're kind of missing some really key things. The regulations that are in place. And by the way, I'm an attorney, so I'm not trying to be critical of regulations or anything, but they're just the ice above the water, the tip of the iceberg above the water. When you're thinking about cybersecurity, you need to be thinking about multiple controls and processes that aren't defined in any regulations. You need to look at bodies like the National Institute of Standards and Technology that publish very in-depth guides to doing things. And then your gap assessments should really basically be based on those. And if you're talking to a credible penetration testing company, they should know that. Now, as far as legal's involvement, I personally don't involve legal too much other than the contracting, because I don't think a lot of this can be privileged. You know, and some people differ on that, but I certainly have a really good relationship with our Office of Legal Affairs. We're actually having a conversation tomorrow about supply chain security and what we can do, but and I brief our general counsel about once every 2 to 3 weeks along for CEO on all the testing we're doing, but it's not directed by counsel. It's really just part of, we think, our ordinary course of business. And I think just ultimately it's just another operational thing we do that, you know, while we brief legal counsel, get their feedback in those briefings, but we're not trying to, you know, keep it privileged or have them directed. We feel that it's something that, you know, myself and others should direct.
I just would be concerned in this day and age, Jennings, with the class action lawsuits that are going on. There's been a big testing of whether or not forensic reports are discoverable, whether or not root cause reports are discoverable by way of the Capital One case. You should, if you don't have it, take a look at it. But I would do everything I could to protect, you know, that testing, even filling out cyber liability, you know, insurance applications, because when there's litigation, that's the first place they go. And if they go back to see what you did, that there were gaps, and most importantly, nothing was done to remediate in a timely fashion, it exposes you somewhat. So, you know, I know no one likes to incur additional legal costs and expenses, and it's certainly more convenient to use in-house counsel because they know your organization the best. But if you're thinking ahead, that should something happen, and everyone knows it does, and that may result in, you know, later litigation, you don't want someone asking in discovery for a copy of, you know, that testing without at least trying to put up a good fight that it's protected under the attorney-client privilege.
Yeah, I would just say my experience, and I've been the CISO at 2 hospitals that at the times paid the largest fines ever under HIPAA, Mass General and NYP. Nothing wound up being privileged, you know. It's just the case law and things are pretty uncertain right now, and I respect people trying to keep it hidden, or hidden's the wrong term, it's pejorative, keeping it privileged. But my personal experience, you know, has been that frankly, the courts have been basically saying, well, this is going to help us dispose of this matter. So you weren't seeking legal advice, you're going to have to turn this over. So, you know, we'll see how this plays out. And, you know, I think ultimately, though, just back to that question, the important thing is that you're doing this. You know, you can have a disagreement about whether it's privileged or not, but the important thing is everyone should be looking at their security posture, both internally and externally. And you have to be willing to find out what's wrong, and you can't be scared of it, because if you don't know your gaps, then you're really going to get hard if there's ever any litigation.
Right.
Yeah, and Jennings, I really would reiterate, as I think about this question, Joe, these assessments need to be done, and they need to become, I think I heard Jennings say, just a part of our life. And it is critical that too many of us are doing assessments every second or third year and only doing it internal. I heard Jennings, and I would reiterate, you need to have some external assessments, whether it's every other year or every second. I like to do an external assessment every other year. I like to get a good, credible assessment. I like a hard-hitting assessment that tells me what's bad. And I think that's critical. The pen testing, I think that's just like Jennings was saying, that's got to be going on every day. You've got to have people on your team who are doing those kinds of things, and you've got to regularly be going external to see, what did your people miss? What didn't we see that the bad actor might have tried? And in fact, I've hired some firms to come in, and when they come in, they use tools and techniques that we haven't ever seen. And then they explain, this is now new technology, new ways that the bad actors are looking to come in. So I think that strengthens us as we look at that and see it from an external perspective, and then change what are we doing internally to address those kinds of new ways.
And I think what you're referring to too, Karl, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know, red team, blue team, and sometimes even purple team testing, just to make sure that, you know, our security operations teams are on their toes and that they know what they have and they know what's going on. So it's that situational awareness that's so important.
Yeah, Joe, we ran at Intermountain, we ran 2 red teams. Were authorized to be running red operations. I had blue teams that were catching. Sometimes we would notify, sometimes we wouldn't. But we were doing those things on a regular basis. And it seemed at first a little bit of conflict between those 2 red teams. But as I shared with them, each of them had different strengths and opportunities for us to leverage. And I think running those things regularly, having things going on, having the pen tests, all of those are just critical parts of what needs to be happening in healthcare. And I like, Jennings, again, what you said, this isn't a measure of compliance. I really worry about programs where we try to measure our compliance with legal or regulatory. What I want to measure, and I tell external assessors as they come in, I want to know the strength of the overall program, the maturity, and how it is doing from a maturity perspective. And are we governed correctly? Are we? And it is important to know that I'm not going to get in trouble with the OCR. It's more important to know that I don't want to check the boxes and say I did. What I want to know is, do I have a good program?
The old saying is, well, at least where I come from, is security and compliance are different things. They sometimes overlap, but they're definitely not the same thing. So you could check and still get hit.
Yeah, that's right.
So we have a question from the audience, Craig Wilhelm, asking, and anyone can answer this, does anyone have any recommendations for a business continuity plan template for a healthcare organization? Anyone want to take a crack?
Well, what I would recommend, this is Jennings, I'd recommend that Nist has a really good business impact assessment document that can be leveraged by organizations to prioritize the technology and processes that are most critical. And it provides guidance for how to develop plans to support those, including not just the technology side, but also the downtime processes and things like that. So I think that's a great place to start. There are other resources, and if there's someone who wants to, contact me outside this meeting, I'll put my email address in the chat, and you can contact me, and I can share with you some of the stuff we've done and how we've thought about it. But I mean, for me, when I first started thinking about this and started my career as a CISO, I literally started with the Nist documentation and used that to help me, begin educating myself about the enormity of conducting just even the business impact assessment you need to do to understand what it means to have your critical information systems down, and then how you would respond to it. And when you say business continuity plan, these days you've got to think about plans for weather events, plans for ransomware. It's more than one plan, right? And it's not, it's not to say you need 5 plans, but your plan has to be written at the right level such that you can handle different fact patterns or scenarios and respond to it, knowing that some of the responses may be different. So it's a pretty big undertaking, and you're not going to find a single template that helps you with, whether it's weather events, terrorism, ransomware. They're different, but they're related, and so it's kind of like a Venn diagram thing where you've got to have something that solves where it overlaps, but also allows for extensions into new fact patterns.
Do you know what, Jennings? I would agree when you asked that question, Joe, about or whoever asked about a template. I don't know that I've seen a template, but I could tell you places I've seen organizations start, places that become successful. One, you've got to have first, what is policy in the organization? So look and see, what is your policy? Policy has to govern. And if you're going to do this by strategy, look at your policy first. What is the policy? Second, you have to look at an inventory. What's the inventory of the data, the applications, the systems that you have? Get that ranked by criticality. What is the ranking of the criticality? Then take a look and identify who are the business owners, and with the business owners, let them determine for you, not IT, let them determine for you what's the critical nature of it. Then you've got to go back up to the C levels and decide if everything is critical, how much does this cost? But the business has to be the driver of this. What is the business impact? What are they willing to tolerate? And we try to put those into buckets of, is it 6 hours or less? Is it 2 days? Is it a week? Is it a month? Let's just try to understand them in buckets. And then you build the plans around first, the most critical. Start and have your plans and create just a simple spreadsheet. Where do you have a plan? And I think for this, there become simple templates and guides that are out there. What does a what does a business continuity, a disaster recovery plan look like? And then you get a checklist and a spreadsheet that tells you, here are all my criticals. Do I have that inventory, and do I have the business leaders buy off? Do I have a disaster recovery? Do I have a business continuity plan? Has it been exercised? Those are just a simple 1, 2, 3 steps that I'd encourage.
I have a quick story to talk about. You know, it was just right before the pandemic broke out that I had just finished up a side project with a fairly significant financial firm in New York City with my former data privacy officer. And it was a business continuity plan. And he and I went to the mat with them to make sure that pandemic was part of it. And I remember getting a call the night before, really all these federal measures were being put into place for quarantine from their chief operating officer saying, thank goodness that we got that in there because, you have Superstorm Sandy, you have obviously COVID-19, you've got all these other things that might not be specifically digital or like ransomware or Stuxnet or something like that, but they still have a major impact on basically doing your work. So I think it's very, very important to incorporate those things into your business continuity plan. The next question I have is for Karen. Karen, what does a breach coach do? When and how is a data breach coach retained, and why is it important to have a breach coach lead the response effort?
Karen, you're muted. You'll want to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. So I serve as a breach coach, and I have for the last 15 years. You ask where they come from. Either a private client will retain someone with a background and experience in cybersecurity and incident response, or there are some cyber liability carriers out there who vet and will put together a panel of vendors, including forensic, breach coaches, public relation firms, credit monitoring firms, people who have a reputation in that area. If you suffer an incident, certainly your first call may be to your cyber liability insurer. Hopefully everyone on this call has a cyber liability policy of insurance. It is extremely important. The unfortunate news about that policy of insurance is that the cost of that policy have gone up dramatically, maybe 20 to 30%. The insurance model is also changing because of the ransomware attacks. The premiums are going up, and now some of these major insurers are talking about co-insurance, which means that if you suffer a ransomware attack and you have to pay $1 million in ransom, they may say, we'll pay the first $500 and you'll have to pay the second $500,000. So that model is changing. But that's how you locate a breach coach. Like the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, a lot of organizations will reach out to experienced breach coaches to create a relationship with them, to get them involved in proactive work, helping them put together an incident response plan, helping them identify an incident response team, policies and procedures, the testing in some circumstances, so that when an incident happens, they know who to call. And as I mentioned earlier, the first 72 hours are very important. Sometimes with regard to the policies of insurance, if you have a relationship with a breach coach, you can ask your broker to endorse that breach coach into the policy. Not all law firms are on all insurance panels. There's so many different insurance carriers out there. But if, for example, Jennings is working with me and he goes through a broker and he's putting the cyber liability policy together and he wants Connell Foley as a designated breach coach, they typically 90% of the time will do that. So what does a breach coach do? We serve basically as the quarterback of the incident response. Once the call is made by the client or the carrier, we take charge. It can be a very fast-moving incident response effort. One of our most important roles is to create an attorney-client privilege or a work product privilege that applies to any and all communications within the incident response effort. What we typically do is hire forensics. We want to be the one hiring them. We get them on the phone. We conduct a scoping call. Based upon that scoping call, there's a statement of work that's put together. Getting back to Jennings' point, those statement of works have become very important to identify the scope and nature of the work being supplied by the forensic investigator, because if it's not phrased accurately, it could be subject to discoverability later. If it comes about that this forensic investigator or security firm was retained prior to the incident and did the same thing prior to the incident that they're doing right now. So it's very important to identify the purpose of their work. And then we start the investigation. We work with the forensic investigator, we work with the client, we work with the FBI at the appropriate time, the US Secret Service. Sometimes we even work with CISA with ransomware attacks, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, another great resource, by the way. You should take a look at their website to find out exactly what happened. Was there access? Was there exfiltration? Was there publication of sensitive information? And that will guide us in determining whether or not notification is required to consumer, to media, to regulatory agencies. Sometimes you have an incident, and based upon our investigation, we find that there was no access or exfiltration requiring notification, which is excellent news. Getting back to the point that you don't jump in and make assumptions early on. We never call it a breach until the end of the investigation, because that will trigger the running of the notification statutes and regulations. Sometimes breach coaches, after the incident is investigated, notification is done, will come in and will represent the client with regard to regulatory enforcement actions or class action lawsuits. So we take charge, we work with our vendors. I will tell you that we have relationships with all the forensic vendors, the PR firms, the credit monitoring. We call it an ecosystem in cybersecurity and incident response. You need to know and be trusted by the other vendors, so that if I pick up the phone and call one of the probably well-known forensic vendors that you all have heard of, they answer me right away, and we jump on the call at any time, 24/7.
Yeah, I gotta say, hiring a breach coach was one of the best moves in my career, at least in my last CISO role, where we were really concerned, being multinational, about data privacy. But then we started to realize that we were under regulations like ITAR, and GDPR wasn't a thing yet. So, but we were still very concerned about those things. And as we brought attorneys in to do that work for us, it was a real education for our inside counsel. So I highly recommend our audience consider that. There is a question within Q&A. Richard Warner asks, how do you get employees to alert or communicate or ask about a potential cybersecurity issue, and doing so that can significantly cut your time to discover a breach? Open to the panel.
Yeah, I'll just say it gets back to your incident response plan. It gets back to educating your workforce, letting them feel comfortable with the fact that they can call the help desk if they detect something, if they think they've clicked on a phishing email, a malicious link, getting them to initially report it and have a plan in place to evaluate and analyze that event or incident to determine whether or not it's something that needs to be evaluated further, or whether or not an incident needs to be called by way of that incident response plan, getting to the point that you contact your carrier or your breach coach. Jennings and Karl, I'll let you jump in on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Joe, this is critical. And I share, as I educate C-levels, I always share this is your best source for information. People will see this. And so we did a number of things trying to educate, trying to train, trying to encourage, sharing people. If you will call and let us know, we put and built inside of our Microsoft environment a fish hook inside Outlook, so that we could have employees click if they suspected, and we used some machine learning to detect if they were correct. But we started to reward and incent those people who did accurately detect and respond quickest. And even when we run our fish tests, we always keep track how many people click, the fish link versus open up the data. And so I think the message that has to be in healthcare is cyber is everyone's job, and the healthcare provider is going to be the one who's going to see these things often quicker than we can. And even though I advocated earlier tools that are so important, they're such an important part of the detection process, people are one of your best tools.
People as a threat intelligence service, huh? And on top of that, you know, that's really, I've noticed, that's why punitive doesn't work. You've got to reward your employees for coming forward, because the more I've noticed, the more punitive we become, the less likely they are to report, because they're afraid of getting in trouble. I mean, who among us isn't, right? We have to say, oh, gee whiz, we sent, you know, all this HR data in the clear, or I think I was a victim of a phishing attack, or I think I gave away some sort of trade secret on a phone call, didn't realize that the person I was speaking to wasn't exactly who they said they were. So it's super important to reward good behavior. You
know, one thing, Joe, that we're doing, and I mentioned this because I think I was a poor communicator about InfoSec when I started. I really talked about HIPAA and compliance because I was a lawyer, and that's why I was hired. You know, the lawyer could spell computer to, you know, be the CISO when we were required to have security rule compliance. And I realized that that didn't really resonate with people. What resonated was talking about InfoSec as part of patient safety, and talking about, you know, things that could impact the ability to deliver care. And as I've gotten better at communicating about it, one of the things that I've been doing now, and I think this is really effective, in addition to phishing and all those things, we actually talk about, we created like a InfoSec brand called InfoSecure, and all we do is we talk about security of you as an individual as part of our education, security of your family, like the risk that you have when you put in like little, you know, baby monitoring cameras, you know, and how those could be misused. And boy, you better secure your Ring cameras. And, you know, it's like almost through osmosis, it gets people caring about security, right? Because we can introduce then these same concepts. So even for back before the pandemic, you know, we had a Bring Your Kids to Work Day, and we actually had 30 minutes where we talked to the kids about their safety online. We had employees dressing up as superheroes or whatever, and we talked about their security. And by doing that, we could actually talk to their parents or the employees about security. So I would encourage people to think creatively, and it's hard, you know, to do it when you have limited staff and things, but find some time where you can to talk about security and other aspects of our lives, because that helps people understand that we have to be security professionals, not just at work, but at home. And people, now that we're all working at home, can take advantage of that. So this all kind of ties together. And this little brand that we created is really successful, and people are clamoring for more. It's been a great success for us.
Fantastic. I'm going to bring Samantha back into the conversation and ask, what are the attack trends that you've been seeing over the last 2 years? Is phishing and ransomware or threat, or is the threat starting to evolve into even more complexity? So, you know, is it run-of-the-mill phishing, run-of-the-mill ransomware, or are we seeing even more nefarious type of attacks?
So the trends that we've seen is a vast increase in the amount of ransomware attacks and business email compromises that the average business is experiencing. And where it's evolving and in complexity is that it's not, first of all, it involves phishing heavily for both different types of attacks, both the business email compromise and ransomware attacks. But it's not phishing attacks where it's as easy to see that it's an attacker. They're posing as vendors of your business. They're posing as family members or your real estate company or an attorney's office. So it makes it much more difficult to detect them. And that's where going back to that, you know, making everybody part of that plan and reporting to the help desk when they experience something. It's so important. And all the points that Karl and Jennings and brought up, it's just absolutely critical. If you see something, say something, because what we're seeing with the phishing emails is that they're crafted much better. They're sent out, someone's clicking on a link and they're getting an error, and then they're like, oh, well, I guess my computer just didn't work. And really, now malware is launched in the background and is infecting your machine. So that's, again, one of those training things and making everybody part of that team. And that awareness is so critical to stopping that. And there were a hospital in Ohio, actually, where they had an employee get a phishing email, click on the link, get an error message, but they reported it right away. And their quick reporting on top of their network segmentation actually ended up really protecting that healthcare network from becoming, immobilized from a ransomware attack. So it's a good example. We are also seeing exploitations of 0 days, 0 day attacks. They're getting a lot larger. So as soon as an exploit is published, for instance, the Citrix vulnerability that came out early in January, that vulnerability, we saw that being taken advantage of in the wild almost immediately. Within a day, we had attacks on infrastructure of partners through that vulnerability. So paying attention to what vulnerabilities come out and be published, and patching and everything else, so unbelievably critical to your network. And I know that's much more difficult in healthcare a lot of times, because you're looking at systems that have lots of different moving parts, interact differently, and don't always work with certain patches and things. But it's absolutely critical.
Thanks for that, Samantha. And there's another question in Q&A, and it's one of my favorites, because I've been very much involved in the safety and security of connected medical devices over the years. So this comes from Al Kinnell, and Al's question is, how much do connected devices, modalities, IoT, other, increase vulnerability? And do you recommend approaches to address this kind of threat? I'm going to just open that up to the panel.
Yeah, from our side of the house, it's absolutely a huge vulnerability aspect that every healthcare system has to deal with. There was a great article in Wired years ago where a CISO of a healthcare organization that covered Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio pen tested their hospital and found all their vulnerabilities, being able to bust into MRI machines, Black Hat, for goodness sake, has had exhibitions where they've hacked pacemakers and insulin pumps. So with all this medical Internet of Thing devices, you've now, and security isn't always built in, and there's sometimes really good reasons for that. With the pacemaker itself, the math there is, if I encrypt this, the battery isn't going to last as long. So is it more important to encrypt it or crack someone's chest open a second time to replace the pacemaker sooner? So we all get that. But with the devices that we can, the pen tester for that hospital system found so many open holes where segmentation of the network became so critical. They were even able to get to a surgical robotic arm, where they didn't actually penetrate the firewall for that robotic arm, but what they did do was make the robotic arm freeze, which is a terrible scenario for a patient. If they're having surgery done by a robotic arm, to now have it stop because it was had an attack going on in the background. So, as Karl and the other panelists talked about earlier, having all of that defense in depth is just absolutely so critical to this. And I'll open it up to the rest of you.
Well, I like where you went, Samantha, and I would share, Al, your question is such a significant one, because inside of healthcare, we're all struggling with just the basic kinds of things, and then getting to medical device, and all of a sudden IoT comes out, and you've got IoT on top of IOMT, and it becomes such a difficult thing. And I'll share with you 3 or 4 suggestions, Al, that you can take a look at. I think this is one that is critical on every CEO's list of key cyber risks. the medical device and the IoT need to be there. And I would probably put these two things together, and I'll explain why. First, if you look at what you need to do, you need to understand strategy and governance around this. And who runs these things, these medical devices, who brings the IoT. And so you need to have a committee. That's strategy and governance. And I would tell you, in most of our shops in healthcare, there will be, for this strategy and governance, there will be someone from the biomedical engineering, somebody from supply chain brought this in, somebody from the medical side, somebody from privacy is involved. So it isn't just one person. This is not just a cybersecurity issue. The failure that we'll have is if we don't get governance and strategy around that. Then you've got to look at, I think as you look at this, what is the strategy and governance first? What is the policy second? Do you have policies that cover these devices? And I always start at the top and think you've got to get strategy, then your policy is what governs what you're going to do. Then you've got to take a look at the inventory. Do you have an inventory? And there are capabilities to do this, Al. You can get the MD² sheets that come out. Not every vendor's providing them, but most are complying now. You can look at discovery tools. There are a number of tools out there that will do passive as opposed to active discovery. We have tried a few. We've had some success with them. You've got to get, though, an inventory put together. Once you get that inventory, you've got to do some kind of classification. You have to understand what the data classification is. You have to understand what the risk classification of the device is, and you've got to get some data categorization. So there are a few kinds of things I'd suggest for you, Al. Put that governance together. If we went a little bit deeper, I'd tell you, you've got to get the risk classification, understanding patient safety versus cyber. And those are both critical concerns, not that one's more or less. And then you've got to look at controls and what kinds of ways to mitigate from. And this conversation always leads us to the idea of segmentation. In order for you to be successful in medical device, in IoT, and any of these things, you have to have network segmentation strategy. And clearly, if you talk to HHS and OCR, they're going to tell you those are things that they expect we're doing. And we all know that those are very hard things to do, but it can be done. And there are tools that do the discovery that also do some of that segmentation for you. So that's kind of a plan, Alan. I think it's an excellent question. You have got to get a handle on that. I think it needs to be in the top 2 or 3 or 4 of all cyber risk right now.
Yeah, Joe, I'd just like to add on to what Samantha said with regard to ransomware. I mean, the two types of attacks that we're seeing all the time as breach coaches are the business email compromise attack and also the ransomware attacks. It used to be you'd toss a coin because you didn't know which one was hitting stronger than the other. But certainly ransomware has evolved very quickly over the years. They have become more sophisticated. There's a concern over a trend building with regard to relationship building between threat actors. There's one threat actor that will drop the malware, and then they'll sell access to another threat actor to detonate the ransomware. So it becomes very complex, but it started with the old model, as you all recall, you know, crown jewels. If you have them, someone's going to attack you. Some people thought if you didn't have the crown jewels, you were never going to be attacked. They'd take them and then steal them and then sell them on the dark web. That evolved to the new model, which involves some encryption. You pay, you get your data back. You don't pay, you don't get your data or systems back. But what we're seeing right now is the double extortion model, which is really a big concern because paying, even if it was an option, becomes very difficult. And so what happens with this double extortion model is that the threat actor comes in, they drop the malware, they conduct reconnaissance, they exfiltrate after the reconnaissance to determine what's sensitive, what's not. They know it has a lot of value, and then they drop the malware. So whether or not you have backup, whether or not you're doing everything correctly may not matter. Because after they drop the ransomware, they'll ask for payment and they'll threaten you with publication of healthcare data, of sensitive data, of even embarrassing data that doesn't require protection, or they'll auction it all. So, when you go to your IT people and they tell you have backup, it's nice to get the information back, but it's sitting out on a wall of shame right now for people to see. Ransomware is a breach under HIPAA. Certainly there is an out if you can show that there is a low probability of compromise of protected health information, and there are various factors that you look at. The identifiers, the threat actor, whether or not that information's been accessed or exfiltrated. But that risk assessment goes right out the door once either a journalist or the FBI or even you find out that that sensitive information is on a wall of shame. People have to make that difficult decision. OFAC has just come out with an advisory, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, basically telling people that you are at risk of sanctions if you make payment to a sanctioned group, and it will be strict liability. The only mitigating factor is if you cooperate with people like Samantha and other law enforcement agencies, sometimes the Department of Justice and OFAC will enter into some type of consent decree with you if you absolutely need to pay to get that information back, but it makes the decision to pay or to suppress that data if it's been published on the wall of shame very difficult. So that's the evolving ransomware attack that we're dealing with today that makes it very difficult.
And fortunately, just to follow up on what you said, Karen, I mean, even when you do pay the actor, that information is out there, and there's absolutely no guarantee they're not going to post it or otherwise sell it, use it. And, there's not a lot of honor among thieves on this one.
That's right. That's right. So be prepared.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to the early 2000s. In the 90s, I had the good fortune of working with a lot of participants in a hacker consortium called Loft Heavy Industries out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And they testified in front of Congress back in '98 in front of Fred Thompson about, threats to critical infrastructure and the sophistication of those threat actors, right? So we have to think about threat actors the same way we think about criminals in the real world, right? You look back at organized crime and you look at the number of quote unquote rackets that they were involved with. And I remember going to my senior leaders back in the early 2000s at that med device company and saying, hey, look, we have to start to take this really, really seriously, not just on the medical device area, but also just a threat to our infrastructure and threat to our trade secrets. And they said, well, that threat actors don't want anything we have. We're not the government. We're not a bank. And we've seen that not to be the case over the last 2 decades, that's for sure. And I think there was also a question from actually one of our panelists behind the scenes about, what's the best way to, I'm going to try and find it here. What's the best way to protect our IoT? I think that's generally what it was. How do you defend against malware and attacks for medical devices, and I presume connected medical devices? Does anyone have a secret formula or a silver bullet for protecting against malware and attacks for medical devices?
Joe, I'll share a few suggestions. I don't know that there is a secret bullet, but I could tell you that what many healthcares are doing is, number one, network segmentation, and I mentioned that up front, understanding that. And secondly, when you look at your inventory, you will find that not every medical device has a network connection capability. So if you know that right up front, that eliminates that from the risk of ransomware if it's not connected. And then even if it does have the ability to connect, not every device that connects has the ability to store, process, transmit data. So as you look at your inventory, those are things that are important to know in the inventory. Does it connect? Can it store, process, transmit? And then as you look, how do you protect that? Certainly what we're all doing, and I'm not going to take credit. I didn't come up with these ideas, but I've shared them with many other CISOs. The ability to put personal firewalls exists, and software-defined networks make that so much easier for us. So where a device must connect, has to connect. The first thing you might try is using whitelists or blacklists. Get with the medical device manufacturer, find out What does this device need on the network? Where is it that it's connecting? Whitelist that, blacklist everything else. If it needs broad general network connectivity, that is not common. So first off, this use of whitelist and blacklist, those are things that we're all employing, we're all doing. And then if ransomware does hit and a device has to be on the network, this use of firewalls is the next thing that we're all trying to do. There are also some tools, and I'm not advertising for vendors, but there are many of the tools now that are out there that help with the discovery process of medical device that also can do routing of traffic. And you can specifically identify traffic patterns, such as what comes out when we get in threat intelligence from the FBI or HISAC, and those people tell us watch for. You can put that pattern into many of the discovery tools, and you can prevent the destinations from receiving it if you're monitoring or using that tool for discovery on your IoT or your IOMT. So those are a couple of things that we've had some success with.
I remember having a conversation with my R&D team who wanted to put connectivity in a surgical stapler. And, I almost put my head in my hands at that moment, because it was, 2007 and the iPhone just came out, and the industry was really going connectivity crazy, in my opinion. And I thought, what is the reason to do this? And what they were trying to do is get the telemetrics off of that stapler to see, how the surgeon was using that stapler. And I get that, but are there other ways to do that? So my recommendation is reach out. If you're a care provider, and the VA has done a great job with this, is work with your med device suppliers and work with them and get them to understand that not everything has to be connected. And that even if their code is absolutely pristine, and we've seen this before, the problems sometimes are in the protocols themselves, like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and the standard IEEE standards. That's where the vulnerabilities start to pop up, because a lot of these standards haven't been changed in 20 years. So there's something to be cognizant of, and I just would like for all the healthcare providers to work very, very closely with the med device manufacturers and question some of the decisions that they're making around their products.
And Joe, just I've worked with a couple of healthcares on this problem and shared a little bit of a recipe that we just talked about. In one case, I found an organization only had 30% of their devices that were connecting or able to connect to the network. In another case, it was a little higher, about 55 or 60%. But if you go through that inventory exercise and the network segmentation, this problem will become a smaller problem. And if you start with that idea of some strategy and governance up front, it makes it much easier to partner with the organization and make this a success.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say, Joe, one last thing. I would also recommend, and this is aligned with what you were saying, you should really make sure when the device is deployed that smart decisions are being made. Quite often they get deployed with default passwords. Those passwords are discoverable through a simple Google search, right? And the admin credentials. Make sure that it's being deployed in a secure way, and don't hesitate to push the folks on it. Sometimes, I won't name vendors, but I've had to choose some out because they're like, oh no, this is secure, and it's like, no, it's not. And they're there to support you and to support your patients, right? So push them, and if they can't answer, tell them they need to be able to come back and answer, because I will tell you that the big companies, who most of us have deployed it, there's a lot of device manufacturers, but most devices are made by the big companies like Philips and et cetera. They care about this. They really do. Doesn't mean that it's filtered down to all arms of the organization. It takes multiple years for things to work through R&D cycles and approvals, but there's some basics around deploying these things on the network that they're responsible for, that you depend on them, and they can do it. So just push them on it.
And we have this issue of a brownfield problem, meaning before the big med device companies took this seriously, we like I said, around 2007 and earlier, we started to put connectivity into almost everything. So now we have this brownfield problem, meaning we've got vulnerable systems that are out there that without a recall or without, some sort of, tearing them down and maybe buying new ones, there's very little we can do to ensure that they're 100% secure. And it'll never be 100%, but 98% secure. And so I was wondering what some of the care providers on the panel are doing about the brownfield problem that we have.
Suffering. I mean, there's a couple things. I mean, one, I'm in the position where I've been actually trying to talk about this with the FDA, and I'll be talking at the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee of the Senate about this as one of the issues. The acronym I always screw up. But anyways, I'm trying to do that. But at a very practical level, I try to work with the biomed team and physician and clinical leaders on trying to phase these things out as fast as we can afford, replacing them, consolidating across our multiple hospitals, but you live with it a little bit. And that's when you kind of turn to the strategies that Karl adeptly described, like segmentation, but it's pretty hard in a hospital, and particularly with our budgets being killed by COVID, for us to just swap out devices, right? And they save patient lives. So you kind of live with it a little bit. And I would say this too, the one area around medical devices that I try to push the hardest on is devices with Windows somehow involved, right? Windows is the operating system that's attacked the most. It's involved in most ransomware attacks. So if you can at least tackle that to the extent you can, that's probably a good place to start.
No truer words, and incentivize your medical device suppliers to maybe use, real-time operating systems and operating systems that were specially crafted for medical devices rather than, commercial off-the-shelf operating systems that we use for back office functions. So with that, unfortunately, we have to wrap. We're coming right up to 2:30 on the East Coast here. And I was just going to pass it back to Anthony and see if there was any last words that Anthony wanted to impart to the audience.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. Super job, Joe, with doing as moderator here. It was fantastic. And I would like to take a moment to say thank you to Karen, Samantha, Jennings, and Karl. I think you guys, all of you, all five, have done a marvelous job in talking about all the ins and outs of ransomware and the issues that everybody is concerned with these days. So it's another great session. I'd also like to take a minute. Up on the screen, we have the professional organizations that helped us put this together. So the Black Long-Term Care Executives, of course, the HIMSS group, the healthcare executives, the National Association of Healthcare Quality folks, the Healthcare Finance Management Association here in Metro New York, as well as the Association for Healthcare Risk Management of New York. Kudos to all of those for helping us put this all together, and I appreciate it. We will be sending out to everybody that registered today a short survey. We want to make sure that we're hitting on all cycles. So I think today we did, but this is to help us for future events that we have. Speaking about future events, we've got a couple coming up. I would ask everybody to check our website, which is nyshimschapter.org. And a couple of them are coming up in February. The 23rd, we have the Diversity Committee will be having an exciting event, and then followed by the Compliance Committee on the 26th. For those that are in privacy, security, and compliance, we have a couple of events that are coming up, both at the end of here, January, and as well as in the month of February. So if you could check the calendar and you're interested in those subjects, please join us. And again, last thing I'd like to say is if you're interested in becoming a member of the New York HIMSS chapter, HIMSS chapter membership only is a $39 fee. If you have some questions, my email address is up on the screen. Feel free to give me a shout, and we'll be more than happy to answer any and all questions for you. Thank you for your time. I appreciate everybody's time. It was a great session, and Joe, marvelous job. And the panel, again, one more time, Karl, Jennings, Samantha, and Karen, Marvelous, marvelous. Thank you very much, everyone.